The year is 1959. The place is the northern Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. This was the era of the Iron Curtain, a time when exploration often intertwined with political secrecy. But for a group of 9 experienced ski hikers, the mission was simple adventure. Led by Igor Dyatlov, a confident and ambitious 23-year-old engineering student, the group was setting out to conquer Mount Otorten, a peak named in the indigenous Mansi language, ominously translated as, "Don't go there." They were all students or graduates of the Ural Polytechnical Institute, seasoned veterans of the Russian winter, and united by a spirit of youthful idealism and robust self-reliance. The goal of the expedition was highly ambitious, a Category 3 trek, the most difficult classification, which would qualify all participants for the prestigious title of Master of Sport of the USSR. Their planned route spanned over 350 kilometers of unforgiving, uninhabited terrain, navigating steep slopes, dense taiga, and the brutal, unpredictable weather systems of the subarctic Urals. This was a test of endurance, skill, and sheer will, and the 9 young people were more than prepared, carrying heavy, high-quality equipment, meticulously planning their supplies, and keeping a detailed expedition journal. The initial stages of the trek were successful, despite the crushing cold. The group traveled by train and then by truck, reaching the small settlement of Vizay on January 25th, the last outpost of civilization. From there, they began their grueling, snow-covered journey into the wilderness. On January 28th, one member of the group, Yuri Yudin, was forced to turn back due to agonizing knee and joint pain, a stroke of fortune that would save his life and leave him forever haunted as the sole survivor. Had he continued, the events that followed would have consumed him, too. With 8 men and 1 woman remaining, the group pressed deeper into the mountains. Their daily routines were documented in their journals and on film, showing images of camaraderie, singing, and the harsh beauty of the winter landscape. The entries were typical of a challenging, yet successful, expedition. They described the difficulty of setting up camp in the deep snow, the satisfying warmth of their tent, and the challenges of the rapidly shifting weather. The journals paint a picture of a capable group facing and conquering the challenges of the harsh Russian winter. On February 1st, 1959, the group was attempting to cross a mountain pass, intending to set up camp on the far side before making the final ascent to Otorten. However, due to deteriorating weather conditions, a blinding snowstorm and strong winds, and perhaps a navigational error, they deviated from their planned route. Instead of descending into the shelter of the forest below, they found themselves on the desolate, exposed eastern slope of a peak the local Mansi people called Kholat Syokol, or Dead Mountain. It was here, exposed to the full fury of the Ural winter, that the group made the fateful decision to pitch their large, 4-season tent. The tent was erected late in the afternoon, dug into the snow to provide minimal protection against the howling winds. This was the last confirmed location of the Dyatlov group. Their meticulous records show that the time was approximately 5:00 p.m. They had dinner, likely a communal meal of dried meat and bread, and prepared for the long, cold night. The silence of the Urals, vast and indifferent, descended upon them. By the following day, February 2nd, the group was expected to begin the final push toward their objective. But they never moved again. Their last known actions were the simple, domestic routines of settling in for the night, actions that would soon be eclipsed by one of history's most chilling and intractable mysteries. The Dyatlov group was due to send a telegram back to their sports club in Vizhay by February 12th. When that date passed without word, no alarm was initially raised. Delays were common in the Urals. The remote, unpredictable weather often postponed arrivals by days or even weeks. It wasn't until February 20th, over a week late, after persistent pleas from family members, particularly Yuri Yudin, the survivor, that the Ural Polytechnical Institute organized a small-scale, internal search party. This delay was the first systemic failure that would later complicate the investigation. The first breakthrough came on February 26th, when a search party consisting of students and military personnel spotted the group's abandoned tent on the slope of Kholat Syakhl. The scene they encountered was utterly baffling and immediately defied rational explanation. The tent had not collapsed naturally. It had been violently cut open from the inside with knives. Several long, jagged slits were observed, suggesting a frantic, immediate need to escape whatever was inside, forcing the 9 people to exit, not through the zippered entrance, but through the canvas wall itself. Inside the tent, all the group's essential survival gear remained undisturbed. Skis, heavy woolen coats, boots, food supplies, Dyatlov's camera, and the expedition journals were all present. It was immediately obvious that the inhabitants had fled in a state of extreme urgency, leaving behind the equipment necessary to survive the sub-zero temperatures of the Urals. The discovery of a half-eaten meal and a small kerosene lamp still resting on a box suggested the hikers had been preparing for bed or were already sleeping when they were forced out. The forensic teams then followed a set of 9 distinct footprints leading away from the tent. These footprints, impressed in the fresh snow, confirmed the initial suspicion. The hikers had fled the tent almost immediately after cutting their way out, wearing only socks, thin shoes, or, most shockingly, barefoot. The prints led downhill toward a dense line of pine forest about 1.5 kilometers away, a clear attempt to seek shelter and warmth from the howling wind and temperatures hovering between 25 degrees C and 30 degrees C. The footprints disappeared near the edge of the forest, erased by wind and recent snowfall. Here, the search began to yield its grim findings. Near a large, prominent cedar tree, the searchers found the first 2 bodies, Yuri Krivonischenko and Yuri Doroshenko. They were dressed only in their underwear, socks, and tattered clothing, and they were barefoot. A few feet away, a small campfire had been haphazardly started, containing only a few small, broken branches. The cedar tree itself was damaged, with branches broken off up to 5 meters high, suggesting that one or both men had desperately climbed the tree for some unknown purpose. The 2 bodies showed no signs of violent trauma, their initial cause of death listed as hypothermia. The discovery of the abandoned tent, cut from the inside, and the 2 barefoot, minimally clothed bodies sitting next to a tiny, failed fire 1.5 kilometers away, immediately transformed a search and rescue operation into a murder investigation. The scene was inexplicable. Why would experienced mountaineers cut their way out of a perfectly functional tent and flee into a blizzard, abandoning their warm clothing to die of exposure next to a tree? This profound, unsettling question was the first layer of the Dyatlov Pass mystery. Following the discovery of Krivonischenko and Doroshenko at the cedar tree, the search continued along the path leading from the tree back up toward the abandoned tent. About 300 meters from the cedar, they found the body of Igor Dyatlov, the group leader. He was lying on his back, his arm raised as if trying to shield his face or reach out. He was slightly better dressed, wearing a sweater, but was still missing outer garments and boots. The cause of death was officially ruled as hypothermia. Closer to the tent, separated by only a few hundred meters, two more bodies were discovered: Zinaida Kolmogorova and Rustam Slobodin. Kolmogorova was found with cuts and bruises on her body, but the official cause of death was, again, hypothermia. Slobodin had a more disturbing injury, a fracture to his skull, a crack approximately 17 centimeters long. Despite this traumatic injury, the medical examiner concluded that the fracture was not severe enough to be fatal. The primary cause of his death was also attributed to hypothermia. The finding of the first 5 bodies established a baffling narrative of events: a panicked flight, a desperate, unsuccessful attempt to build a fire, and death by exposure, but the details added layers of confusion. The bodies were found in positions suggesting they were attempting to return to the tent for their clothing and gear, not fleeing away from it. Dyatlov was oriented toward the tent, as were Kolmogorova and Slobodin. This suggested that once the initial terror had passed, reason had returned, and they knew they had to retrieve their supplies to survive. Furthermore, forensic examination revealed unsettling details about their clothing. Investigators noted that some garments were later found to have belonged to different people. For instance, Dyatlov was wearing one of Krivonichenko's socks, and Kolmogorova was found wearing clothing identified as belonging to Doroshenko. This suggested a powerful, life-saving act of exchange and redistribution of available warm clothing among the survivors, a deliberate attempt to preserve heat and stave off the cold. This act of altruism contradicts the image of a chaotic, self-serving panic. The injuries sustained by the first 5 victims, cuts, bruises, and Slobodin's skull fracture, were all deemed non-fatal. Hypothermia was determined to be the ultimate killer. This ruling satisfied the initial inquiries, suggesting that the initial, terrifying event had caused them to panic and flee, and the severity of the cold had done the rest. However, this conclusion failed entirely to address the central question: what caused 9 experienced, well-equipped mountaineers to flee their tent in such a desperate, suicidal manner, abandoning their only means of survival? The evidence collected from the first 5 victims merely deepened the enigma. The state of their clothes, their positions on the slope, and the mysterious cut in the tent indicated that an overwhelming force or threat had driven them out, but that the subsequent cause of death was purely environmental. The terrifying mystery of the event that night on Kholat Syakhl remained stubbornly unsolved, waiting for the discovery of the final 4 to reveal its true, horrifying scale. The search for the remaining 4 hikers, Nikolai Theboks, Brignoles, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolovatov, and Alexander Zolotaryov, was suspended throughout the harsh weather of March and did not resume until the spring thaw. It took over 2 months, until May 4th, for a military search team to make the most disturbing and crucial discovery of the entire investigation. The bodies were found deep within a ravine in the forest, approximately 75 meters from the cedar tree, buried under 4 meters of snow in a partially frozen stream bed. Unlike the first 5, the final 4 were significantly better dressed, indicating they had taken clothing from the first group, either from the initial victims at the cedar tree or from the small cache of discarded items. However, their injuries were exponentially more severe and defied any rational explanation based on hypothermia alone. Nikolai Theboks, Brignoles, was found with a massive skull fracture, described as a depression so severe that it was essentially a crushed cranium. The official report concluded that the force required to inflict such an injury was akin to that of a car crash, or a massive blow from a heavy object. This was no mere fall, this was a violent, crushing impact. Ludmila Dubinina and Alexander Zolotaryov suffered the most grotesque and inexplicable injuries. Dubinina was found with broken ribs on one side of her body, and Zolotaryov had broken ribs on both sides. Crucially, the official forensic report stated that these fractures were caused by an extremely high, non-human force. Moreover, Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, soft tissues around her eyes, a part of her lips, and facial bone fragments. Zolotaryov was also missing his eyes and some soft tissue. The forensic doctor who examined them, Boris Vozrozdeny, emphasized that the external injuries did not match the internal trauma. There were no signs of blunt force trauma on the exterior of the skin where the ribs were broken, suggesting the injuries were inflicted by an overwhelming force, likely a crush, that did not break the skin. The lack of external defense wounds, combined with the catastrophic internal damage, ruled out a typical physical assault by a human. The bizarre discovery of the missing soft tissues and eyes added an element of horror. While initial theories suggested animal predation, the bodies were found partially submerged in the running water of the stream. Subsequent experts concluded that the soft tissue could have been naturally removed by scavenging aquatic animals after the individuals were already deceased. But this explanation failed to account for the systematic nature of the missing parts and the severity of the facial trauma. Finally, further forensic testing revealed another deeply unsettling detail: the clothing of three of the victims, Kolevatov, Dubinina, and Zolotaryov, contained traces of radiation, specifically high-energy beta radiation. While the levels were not immediately lethal, they were inexplicably high for clothing that had simply been exposed to the wilderness. The investigation offered no explanation for the source of this radiation, adding a terrifying, invisible layer to the mystery. The investigation was officially closed shortly after the discovery of the final four, citing a compelling natural force as the cause of death. The case materials were classified as secret and archived, only to be made public years later, ensuring the true, terrifying nature of the final four's injuries became the centerpiece of the enduring, global enigma known as the Dyatlov Pass Incident. The official investigation into the deaths of the 9 hikers was launched by the local public prosecutor, Vasily Tempelov, but was quickly taken over by the regional prosecutor, Lev Ivanov. The investigation was conducted rapidly, under the close, often inhibiting, supervision of senior Communist Party officials. The final case file, known as Case 3707, was officially closed on May 28, 1959, a mere 3 weeks after the final bodies were discovered. The final conclusion, as issued by Prosecutor Ivanov, stated that the hikers died as a result of a compelling natural force which they were unable to overcome. This vague, carefully worded phrase was designed to be definitive yet unspecific, avoiding any mention of the violent trauma, the cut tent, the inexplicable radiation, or the missing body parts. The key evidence that was consciously ignored or downplayed included, first, the unexplained internal trauma to Thegoks, Brignoles, Dubinina, and Zolotaryov. The official conclusion dismissed the car crash-level forces required to inflict the injuries, simply categorizing them as trauma sustained in a fall, an explanation deemed medically impossible by experts examining the report decades later. The absence of external wounds on the broken ribs was never reconciled with a simple fall. Second, the radiation contamination found on the clothing. The case file offered no scientific explanation for the high levels of beta radiation, simply recording the fact and then ignoring it in the final conclusion. This omission was particularly suspicious given the Soviet Union's deep secrecy surrounding any nuclear activities, even seemingly minor ones. Third, the Mansi legend and local history. The indigenous Mansi people, who used the Koletsyakol area for hunting, believed the mountain to be a place of dark spirits and ill fortune, warning outsiders away. The initial murder investigation focused on a possible attack by the Mansi, but this theory was quickly and thoroughly debunked. The Mansi were found to be peacefully living far from the area, and the footprints found at the scene were clearly those of the hikers themselves, ruling out any external human involvement. The prompt closure of the case and the classification of its documents as secret immediately fueled suspicion. The secrecy suggested that the Soviet authorities were not trying to hide a natural disaster, but rather a state secret, perhaps a failed military test, an encounter with some sort of restricted technology, or an event that would expose a severe national vulnerability. This suspicion was reinforced by the fact that the initial findings were sensational and leaked to the press, yet the official response was silence, followed by a vague, sanitized final statement. The original case file was eventually released in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. However, key pages were reported to be missing or redacted, and the photographic negatives from the scene were either destroyed or inexplicably missing. The deliberate obfuscation by the authorities, the rushed conclusion, the ignoring of critical evidence, and the classification transformed the Dyatlov Pass Incident from a mountain tragedy into a deep, enduring mystery of the Cold War era. The greatest enigma was not what killed the hikers, but what the Soviet government was so desperately trying to hide. The failure of the Soviet investigation to offer a credible, coherent explanation for the Dyatlov Pass incident has generated a relentless wave of theories attempting to solve the mystery. These theories range from the mundane and natural to the exotic and terrifying, each seeking to reconcile the fundamental contradictions of the evidence: the internal tent cuts, the hypothermia, the massive chest and head trauma, and the radiation. One of the most persistent natural theories is the wind slab avalanche hypothesis. This suggests that a rare, localized avalanche, caused by the cutting of a snow cornice, or slab, occurred shortly after the hikers settled down. The sound of the slab cracking might have panicked the group, leading them to quickly cut their way out of the tent to avoid being buried alive. The non-fatal injuries, Slobodin's crack, could have been sustained during the initial panic or fall. The final four, found deep in the ravine, may have fallen into the ravine during the chaotic flight and were later crushed by deep snow, explaining the immense, non-external pressure on their bodies. This theory, however, fails to convincingly explain why the group did not attempt to recover their clothes after the immediate danger passed, or the high levels of radiation. Another natural explanation involves the phenomenon of infrasound, or low-frequency sound generated by extreme weather conditions. The topography of Koletsyakol, with specific wind patterns funneling into the pass, could have created infrasound waves. These waves are known to induce feelings of intense fear, panic, nausea, and hallucinations in humans. The theory posits that the hikers were driven to irrational panic by this undetectable, terrifying sound, leading them to cut the tent and flee. The subsequent trauma could then be explained as injuries sustained in the chaotic, blind flight in the dark. This is a compelling psychological explanation, but lacks any concrete physical evidence of infrasound at the specific time and place. The most widely circulated secret theories center on a Soviet military test. This posits that the hikers accidentally stumbled upon a secret testing ground for new weapons or high-altitude ballistics. The horrific, non-external crush injuries could have been caused by a pressure wave from a low-altitude explosion of a new type of weapon, such as a fuel-air bomb. The radiation found on the clothes could be explained as fallout from an experimental dirty bomb. The government's hasty cover-up and classification of the case would be entirely consistent with the desire to conceal a failed or unauthorized military operation. However, no credible evidence of a military test in that exact area has ever surfaced. The most bizarre, yet perennially popular, theories involve the paranormal or extraterrestrial. These theories focus primarily on the bizarre light phenomena reported by other groups of hikers in the region during the same time period. Multiple independent testimonies described strange, orange spheres of light moving in the sky over the Urals in the weeks surrounding the incident. Proponents of this theory suggest the hikers were either attacked by an unexplained entity or that the light was related to a highly advanced, secretive technology that caused the traumatic injuries and radiation, but the evidence remains purely anecdotal and circumstantial. Ultimately, no single theory completely accounts for every contradictory piece of evidence: the cut tent, the barefoot flight, the non-fatal hypothermia, the crushed bodies, and the unexplained radiation. This lack of a coherent narrative ensures that the Dyatlov Pass Incident remains the world's most enduring and terrifying mountain mystery. Among the most unsettling pieces of evidence in the Dyatlov Pass Incident is the forensic finding of radioactive contamination on the clothing of at least 3 of the victims, Kolevatov, Dubinina, and Zolotaryov. The official case file simply recorded the presence of high-energy beta radiation, but offered no explanation, a silence that many believe points directly toward a deliberate cover-up of a state secret. The initial levels of radiation detected were not high enough to have caused acute radiation syndrome, ARS, or the deaths of the hikers. However, they were significantly elevated above what would be considered natural background levels. This meant the contamination must have come from an artificial source. The clothing was either directly contaminated by a radioactive substance or exposed to a massive fallout event. One leading hypothesis related to the radiation involves the possibility of a nearby, secret military nuclear facility or test site. The Soviet Union conducted extensive, often reckless, nuclear research and testing throughout the Cold War, and many sites were kept classified. A massive accident, or a poorly contained test, could have released localized plumes of contamination. If the hikers had unknowingly stumbled into such an area, or if fallout had drifted over the pass, it could explain the contamination and the military's subsequent, immediate intervention to classify the case. A second, more direct theory suggests that the hikers themselves may have handled or encountered some form of radioactive material. Some have speculated that the group, particularly the students from the Technical Institute, may have been involved in a side mission, perhaps secretly documenting or collecting information on a supposed secret uranium mine in the area. However, this is largely unsubstantiated speculation based on the Cold War context and the students' backgrounds. The most plausible connection lies in the Soviet nuclear program's proximity. While the Dyatlov Pass area itself was not a known testing ground, it was geographically close to major nuclear facilities, including the infamous Mayak Production Association in the Chelyabinsk region, which had experienced the Kyshtym disaster, a massive nuclear waste explosion in 1957. Although the Kyshtym event happened 2 years earlier, it is conceivable that long-range atmospheric contamination or other unreported incidents could have occurred, leading to localized fallout. The key piece of evidence remains the government's reaction. In 1959, any public mention of radiation or nuclear activity was treated with the highest degree of secrecy. The prosecutor's decision to note the radiation but completely ignore it in the final conclusion is, for many analysts, the most compelling evidence of state interference. It was deemed safer to leave the deaths unexplained than to admit to the existence of a nearby, undisclosed radiation source that could damage the image of Soviet technological and military infallibility. The radiation enigma transforms the Dyatlov Pass incident from a story of a mountain tragedy into a chilling narrative about the perils of secrecy in the Cold War. It suggests that the unseen, radioactive hand of the state may have been the true, compelling force that drove the 9 young people to their bizarre, terrifying end. Over 6 decades have passed since the 9 young hikers died on Kholat Syakhl. Yet the Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the world's most enduring and fascinating unsolved mysteries. The case, once buried under Soviet secrecy, has become a global phenomenon, captivating generations and inspiring endless investigation, both official and amateur. The enduring power of the mystery lies in its fundamental contradictions. It is a case where the forensic evidence, the crushed bodies, the cut tent, the radiation, seems to rule out any conventional explanation, forcing investigators to confront the truly inexplicable. It challenges our understanding of survival, panic, and the limits of natural forces. The story stands as a stark testament to the terrifying realization that, sometimes, the truth simply cannot be reconciled with our knowledge of the world. In 2019, the Russian Federation's Prosecutor General's office reopened the investigation, attempting to provide a definitive answer and bring closure to the families. Their conclusion, announced in 2020, favored the wind slab avalanche hypothesis, stating that a rare, sudden avalanche forced the hikers out of their tent, and the combination of the extreme cold and poor visibility prevented them from finding their way back to safety. They also cited the katabatic wind, a fierce, descending cold wind, as a major contributing factor. However, this modern official conclusion, like the 1959 original, has failed to satisfy the most dedicated researchers. Critics point out that the avalanche theory still doesn't explain the crushing, non-external trauma, the lack of evidence of an avalanche path in the area, or the radiation, the persistent gaps in the evidence, the missing pages in the file, the lack of photographic negatives, the ignored radiation continue to suggest that the definitive truth remains hidden, possibly forever sealed within the vaults of Cold War history. The legacy of the Dyatlov Pass incident is more than just a detective story. It is a profound lesson in secrecy and its devastating consequences. The Soviet government's initial impulse to conceal the truth, whatever it was, ensured that the event would forever be viewed through a lens of suspicion and paranoia. By issuing a vague, unsatisfying conclusion, they inadvertently created the very mystery they sought to avoid, allowing speculation, fear, and intrigue to fill the vacuum of official silence. Today Kholat Syakhl, or Dead Mountain, remains a powerful, somber place. It is a monument to 9 adventurous young lives, tragically cut short, and a chilling reminder that sometimes the most dangerous force in the wilderness is not nature itself, but the hidden, arbitrary power of the state. The truth of the Dyatlov Pass incident, like the Ural winter, remains cold, harsh, and utterly unforgiving.